Hey folks, welcome back to my channel. Welcome back to my greenhouse. My name is Joe. This is going to be really exciting today. Why? Because it is a special edition video. It's a collaboration video with Lyn Kimberley from Desert Plants of Avalon. I'm sure you've come across her channel here on YouTube. It's a huge channel about cacti and other succulent plants. She's been around for quite some time and she's got fantastic content about growing these wonderful plants. And what Lyn and I discussed and decided to do was just both take a perspective on one theme, one topic, which actually is really interesting to both of us, and that is how we both got hooked on cacti and other succulent plants, how we both started collecting, how we both started growing these fantastic plants, and how we got into our hobby. And maybe there's some inspiration, maybe there's some parallels to things that you're going through or have gone through as you got connected with this hobby. So what is it you need to do? Well, first of all, watch this video here and then go straight over to Lyn's channel, Desert Plants of Avalon. The link is down below in the description of this video, but also at the top here, you can see the link over to Lyn's video and channel. So as I say, watch this perspective and then move over and listen and watch Lyn's perspective. So both Lyn and I, when we were discussing this collaborative effort, we were both actually agreeing that, the topic of how do you actually get to grow, how do you get to collect cacti and other succulent plants is a really interesting one that, everyone basically, I think, can look back to those moments of when they got their first cactus, maybe a couple of cacti, and how things developed further down the road, leading often to huge collections, beautiful greenhouses full of wonderful plants. And it's always fantastic and fascinating to sort of look back, how did it all start? Now, in my case, it started back in 1973. I was 12 years at that point in time, and I had actually been visiting my granddad in the city of Frankfurt. And it was a bit of a rainy day, and there was not that much to do while I was visiting my granddad. And, he decided that maybe we should just do a little trip down into the city and maybe even visit the botanical gardens there. Little did he know that that was going to be a sort of a pivotal moment for me as a young person, and that was going to start a lifelong hobby, an addiction to these plants. And, it was the start of something bigger to come. On this particular rainy afternoon in Frankfurt, my granddad took me to the Palmengarten, the Palm Gardens, another name for one of the botanical gardens in the city of Frankfurt. And it has a absolutely fantastic collection of cacti and other succulent plants, among many other plants, of course. Already back in 1973, the collection was just absolutely mind-boggling. By the way, if you would like to see what that collection in the Palmengarten looks like these days, I've got a video on my channel that actually is all about a visit to that Palmengarten, and it shows you that most amazing collection of huge cacti and other succulents, a whole euphorbia forest, for example. and it gives you an idea of how, probably an event like visiting that place can sort of shift things in the minds of a little boy, like myself at the time, 12 years old. So as we walked through the greenhouses of this botanical garden, my granddad, he was just kind of looking at the plants. He didn't know too much about plants. He wasn't a gardener or anything like that. But I think he could see how I was being influenced by these most amazing, just crazy looking plants that I had actually hardly ever seen before in my life. There were instances, of course, where I had been seeing cacti that people were growing on their windowsills. My uncle, he had a couple of what I now know were echinopsis and an opuntia that he was growing on his kitchen windowsill. I also remember seeing a whole bunch of cacti being sold at one of the village markets in the town that I was living in at the time. And that was actually something which had always fascinated me. Just the shapes, the different sizes, these just most unusual flowers, the spines, the different colors, all these weird and wonderful plants. They were actually quite a fascination for me. So, on the day following that famous visit to the botanical gardens with my granddad, I went downtown where I knew there was a little shop, a little flower shop, that occasionally was also selling cacti. And I had secretly scraped together all my pocket money, and I took that along. Didn't actually tell anyone where I was going that day, so snuck out of the house, took a bus, went downtown to that florist shop, and guess what? They had four cacti, and how many did I buy? All four. I remember taking a picture of those four cacti when I got back home, but unfortunately, that picture seems to have gone lost. But I do remember from my memory and from my notes, because believe it or not, I was always taking notes. That's how fascinated I was about these plants. And it was notes about, what people were telling me about how to grow these plants, where they were actually coming from, the names, and things like that. So those Fab Four cacti, they were a mammillaria, an opuntia, an echinopsis, and a nottocactus, a nottocactus otonis, which had the most amazing yellow flowers. And in fact, that nottocactus and the mammillaria, I think it was a Xylmaniana, they were the first two cacti that also showed their beautiful flowers for me when I was growing them on my windowsill. Now, funny enough, it didn't take very long for word to spread in my family, in among the relatives, but also friends, that I was interested in growing cacti. And suddenly there were, people volunteering little pups, little cuttings, cacti that they had been growing, and they thought, well, here's a expert, and why not give him my cactus, because maybe he'll get it to flower or to grow better than it did on their windowsill or something like that. But anyway, within a very short amount of time, I actually had a little collection that was starting to grow and grow and grow. So before I knew it, I had this rapidly growing little collection of cacti, various types, and I was growing them in the garden of my parents. I had this little corner where I started to actually plant them into larger trays. Funny enough, already in those days, it seems, I was obsessed by this idea of just growing cacti, not just in little pots, but to actually grow them as a community, if you like, in, beds where they would be able to grow with ornamental rocks and things like that in a little bit of a landscape resembling the natural habitats that these plants, as I have been reading, were actually coming from. Now, another person who was actually quite influential, albeit in an indirect way, was my dad. My dad had always been obsessed by growing, especially orchids, but also other plants. That was actually quite fascinating for me. But in a way, of course, if dad does A, well, maybe the son should do B, that kind of attitude, a bit, the little plant rebel, I suppose, wanted to grow something different, wanted to do something different. So if dad does orchids, which are from a wet, hot, humid climate, well, kind of logical that the son would now start specializing on plants from exactly the opposite type of growing climate, arid environments, cacti. That sounded like the challenge that I had to go after. Now, the great thing about this, of course, was it was a kind of a symbiosis, because what it allowed us to do was to plan and build. And this was into my probably third year or so. I think I was 15, um, into my third year or so of the hobby. We decided to buy the components and build a little greenhouse of our own. And we were going to put a little separator running through the middle of the greenhouse. And he was going to grow his orchids on one side, and I was going to grow my cacti on the other. How does that sound? Now, I have to say, I think my dad was a lot more accommodating than I probably was, because rather than me going for, tropical, subtropical type, maybe epiphytic cacti, well, no, kind of stubborn, I had to stay with those arid, hot environment type plants. So what he decided to do was to specialize on orchids that would actually be, especially in the winter, these are orchids that don't need tropical temperatures, so-called cold house orchids. And in the summer, he'd have them outside of the greenhouse, he'd have them out in the garden, in the shade of trees, and then bring them in the winter, and they would actually quite like a cool, dry climate like I was having on my side of the greenhouse anyway for my cacti. Now, as I said, I was always taking notes, but how do you actually get to proper information about growing these sort of plants at a time when, of course, there was no internet, and there were also actually just very limited resources where you could look up information. Basically, it was down to getting books. So I was a regular visitor of the local library, the public library in our town, and guess what? They had 3 books about growing cacti. When they eventually came back on the shelf of the library, I immediately grabbed them, I subscribed, and I just gobbled up all the information that was written in those 3 books. And I was just like a sponge trying to find out more information about what type of cacti there were, what were the ones that I had, how would you actually best grow them, how would you get them to flower, all these questions that we all have. And in today's world, of course, you just type in those search words, and within a couple of seconds you've got a wealth of information on the web available for you. You've got resources like this one here, the YouTube channels, you've got, you know, the Instagrams, the Facebooks, you name it. All that information that is out there readily available for us these days is just fantastic, of course. But in those days, long treks to the library, to the public library, many a disappointment when the shelf was empty, the books were out, but when the books were in, reading time. Looking back, one of the fascinating things that I was involved in as a at that time, then 15 or 16-year-old, was, you know, when my dad and I were building our greenhouse. It also involved, of course, putting the glass up on that greenhouse, cutting it into the right sizes. Now, where did I access those skills and that information? You know, well, this actually had to do with some of the backgrounds to the hobby, because as you can imagine, with a rapidly growing collection, my pocket money was obviously never sufficient to help me buy some of those new plants and gadgets, and, you know, some of the fertilizers and all the stuff that you need for the hobby. So I decided I was going to work in my spare time, you know, after school. And of course, not just any job, but I was looking for a job where I had access, exposure to, guess what? Cacti. So remember this person I was talking about who was selling cacti at the local market? Well, I walked up to that person one day and I said, "Are you looking for someone? You know, I'll do whatever types of jobs you need done in your greenhouse or selling or whatever." He was willing to take a chance, and he hired me for a couple of Deutschmarks an hour. And in fact, it was a great scheme because, you know, I got a little bit of pocket money extra, but more importantly, every now and then he was cleaning out his greenhouse, and there were all these plants that he was, you know, wanting to get rid of. And guess where they went? Who got those as a little bonus in addition to the salary, if you like, the little pocket money? But in this way, I actually also learned a hell of a lot about, you know, all the facets, all the perspectives of growing our plants. You know, just seeing from him, learning from him, the type of substrate, the soil that he was mixing. He was obviously potting and repotting plants. So everything to do with growing cacti, the cultivation. This was, of course, a professional gardener who had learned all the tricks of the trade, and I was again like a sponge. One of the things I did very early on in my hobby was to become a member of a cactus society. The German Cactus Society was the first one that I joined. Actually, that was into my second year of being in the hobby. And I very soon thereafter also became a member of the British Cactus and Succulent Society, that also had and still has a wonderful a magazine, a journal that you know, has all kinds of wonderful information about our hobby. As I said, I actually joined some cactus and succulent societies quite early on, and that really enabled me to just meet like-minded people, to trade plants, to have access to plants that, you know, people were themselves growing, plants that I was growing I could trade, and so on. Also, there was a lot of information being shared, for example, about plant sales that were being organized, and also trips that were being organized to visit cactus nurseries. There were so many, and still are so many, advantages of being a member of a cactus society. You know, I would really urge you to take a look in your own country that you're living and growing your plants in. I'm sure there is a cactus society of some sort. Now, at the same time, you might say, well, I don't really need to go into that level of, seriousness with my hobby. I'm just happy with a couple of cacti that I'm growing on my terrace or on my windowsill. And, that's enough for me. And you know what, I can fully subscribe to that as well. I think everyone should really just decide for themselves the level of engagement, if you like, that you'd like to take your hobby to. I have to say, growing cacti as a hobby was not a very popular, a very widespread thing at all in those days. This was mid 70s, and it was mainly, I think, people who were really interested, specialists very often in these type of plants. And you had all kinds of, very botanically inclined people, maybe more also from the scientific side, that were keen to be growing these plants. But you didn't have the wide interest, the wide groups of people like you have these days, which is wonderful. That there's, probably tens, many tens of thousands of folks like yourselves out there who are interested in these plants. And you may have anything from one or two on your windowsill all the way to huge collections and greenhouses full of the plants. And you may be a novice, you may be very experienced, the whole bandwidth. And there's such a huge, very, very connected community these days, a globally connected community through the web, of course, and the social media. Anyway, I am going to stop rambling and I'm going to stop boring you now. I think I've hopefully given you a little bit of an overview of how I actually got hooked on these plants. Well, I hope you enjoyed this topic. I hope you enjoyed this video. And before I let you go to jump over to Lyn's channel and to watch her video on this topic, remember, Desert Plants of Avalon, let me just ask you to, if you like this video, just leave me a like, leave a comment if you like, and if you haven't yet subscribed to this channel, I would be really appreciative if you did subscribe, because in any case, I'd like to thank you for taking the time to watch this video, to dial into this channel today. And as always, hope to see you very soon again. Take care and happy growing.